There's nothing quite like the silence of an empty home, where children's laughter once echoed through every room. The kind of quiet that settles into your bones and makes you question if happiness was ever real, or just a beautiful dream you're slowly forgetting. Sabina lived in that silence, a widow at the edge of the Roman frontier. One evening, there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find a man in simple clothes, dusty from travel. "I was told you are alone," he said. "Let me give you Heirs, woman." She didn't know he was Emperor Valerian. She only saw a man who seemed as lonely as she was. Night after night he returned to her cottage. But what happens when love grows between two people who have forgotten how to trust their own hearts? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bronze military seal lay wrapped in linen at the bottom of Sabina's wooden chest, beneath her winter cloak and the few precious belongings she'd managed to preserve through 5 years of solitude. Marcus Aurelius Corvus, the name etched into the metal, still caught the lamplight when she unwrapped it on those nights when grief demanded remembrance. Her husband's seal, carried home by a fellow legionnaire who'd survived the Rhine campaign, was all that remained of the man who'd once filled her cottage with his booming laughter and gentle hands. Sabina's days began before dawn, as they had for longer than she cared to count. The stone floors of her cottage were cold against her bare feet as she stirred the embers in her hearth, coaxing them back to life with dried kindling and the practiced breath of someone who'd learned to make fire obey her will. The cottage itself was modest. 2 rooms built of local stone, with a thatched roof that Marcus had repaired himself the summer before he marched away to war. It sat at the edge of Calum village, close enough to hear the morning bells, but far enough to maintain the solitude that had become both her sanctuary and her prison. The village of Calum perched on a hillside overlooking the valley that stretched toward Rome's northern frontier. Here the empire's influence grew thin, like oil spread too wide across water. The streets were unpaved earth, worn smooth by generations of feet, cartwheels, and the hooves of the occasional imperial messenger's horse. Stone houses clustered around a modest forum, where merchants hawked their wares on market days, their voices mixing with the bleating of goats and the laughter of children, whose mothers watched them with the fierce protectiveness of those who lived where civilization met wilderness. Elder Cassius had governed the village for 20 years, his weathered face bearing the lines of someone who'd learned to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between prosperity and starvation, peace and raid. His house stood at the village's heart, larger than most but not ostentatious, a man of authority who understood that respect came not from displays of wealth, but from consistent fairness and the wisdom to know when rules needed bending. He'd been Marcus's friend before becoming Sabina's unofficial protector, though she'd made it clear she needed no man's guardianship. The merchant Lucia arrived with the trading caravans twice each month, her wagon loaded with goods from distant cities, fine pottery from Gaul, Spanish olive oil, and the occasional luxury that reminded the villagers they were still connected to the greater world. She was a widow herself, though by choice rather than tragedy. Her husband had died of fever 10 years past, and she'd discovered she preferred the independence of the merchant's road to the constraints of remarriage. Lucia's friendship with Sabina had grown slowly, built on shared understanding of what it meant to navigate the world without a man's protection or permission. Young Felix had arrived in Calum 2 years ago, fresh from his theological studies in Rome, carrying the earnest enthusiasm of someone who believed faith could solve any problem. The village's previous priest had died of old age, leaving behind a small stone church that needed constant repair, and a congregation that appreciated practical wisdom more than elaborate sermons. Felix had learned to adjust his scholarly Latin to the rough frontier dialect, and his genuine compassion had gradually won over even the most skeptical villagers. Sabina's reputation had evolved from grieving widow to valued healer over the years since Marcus's death. It had begun with simple remedies, brewing willow bark tea for Elder Cassius's joint pain, preparing poultices for children's cuts and scrapes. Word spread that the widow Sabina had gentle hands and knew which herbs could ease suffering. Women began arriving at her door, seeking help with difficult pregnancies, and men came quietly asking for tonics to restore their strength after illness. She never charged for her services, accepting instead whatever people could offer: eggs from their hens, wool for spinning, repairs to her cottage's shutters. The knowledge hadn't come easily. In the desperate months after her children's deaths, when fever had swept through the village like a malevolent spirit, Sabina had thrown herself into learning everything she could about healing. She'd sought out the old women who remembered traditional remedies, bartered with traveling physicians for knowledge, and spent countless hours in the hills gathering plants, testing their properties through careful observation and bitter experience. It was easier to focus on others' pain than to face her own. Her daily routine had become a meditation on survival. After tending her fire, she would check her small garden, where she grew the herbs that formed the foundation of her healing practice. Chamomile for soothing nerves, lavender for restless sleep, echinacea to boost the body's defenses against illness. The garden was surrounded by a low stone wall that Marcus had built to keep out the rabbits. Each stone placed with the care of a man who expected to watch his vegetables grow for decades to come. Inside her cottage, dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, filling the air with their earthy scent. Clay pots lined shelves along the walls, each containing carefully prepared tinctures, oils, and powdered remedies. The large table that dominated the main room served multiple purposes: preparing meals, mixing medicines, and the intricate weaving that provided her with small income. Her loom stood in the corner by the window, where the morning light was strongest, and the rhythmic sound of her shuttle had become as much a part of the village's daily music as the church bells and the blacksmith's hammer. The frontier had its own rhythms, different from the bustling cities where merchants shouted their wares and senators debated policy. Here, survival depended on reading subtler signs: the way clouds gathered on the horizon, the behavior of wildlife that might signal approaching storms, or the movement of raiders from beyond the frontier. The villagers had learned to be self-sufficient, to make do with what they had, and to help their neighbors without expecting immediate repayment. Sabina's place in this community had been hard-won. As a childless widow, she occupied an unusual position, no longer under a husband's authority, but without children to ensure her security in old age. Some of the other women had initially viewed her with suspicion, wondering if she might try to steal their husbands or corrupt their children with her independence. But time and consistent character had worn down their resistance. She attended church services, contributed to community work projects, and never spoke against the natural order of things. She simply lived her life with quiet dignity and offered help when it was needed. The evenings were the hardest. When the day's work was finished and the village settled into the peaceful routine of family dinners and children's bedtime stories, Sabina's cottage seemed to echo with the absence of voices that would never return. She tried filling the silence with various activities: more weaving than she could sell, herbs prepared far in advance of need, endless cleaning of spaces that were already spotless. Sometimes she would visit Lucia or sit with Elder Cassius, discussing village affairs, but most nights she simply sat by her fire, watching the flames dance and remembering. The memories were both blessing and curse. Marcus's face had begun to blur around the edges, like a painting left too long in sunlight, but she could still recall the sound of his voice calling her name when he returned from the fields. Her children, little, Julia with her gap-toothed grin, and Marcus the younger, who'd inherited his father's stubborn chin, lived on in moments of perfect clarity that struck without warning. Julia's laugh echoing from the garden where she'd chased butterflies, young Marcus solemnly helping his father repair the roof, his small hands mimicking every motion with fierce concentration. The fever had taken them both within a week, and no amount of herbal knowledge could have saved them. Sabina had learned that lesson in the cruelest possible way, that healing had limits, that love couldn't conquer everything, and that sometimes the only choice was to bear witness to loss with whatever grace you could muster. The guilt had nearly destroyed her. If she'd known then what she knew now about treating fevers, if she'd sought help sooner, if she'd been a better mother, a more observant healer, Elder Cassius had been the one to pull her back from the edge of that darkness. "The village needs you," he'd said simply, arriving at her door with a woman in difficult labor when Sabina hadn't left her cottage in 3 weeks. "This baby needs you." It had been the beginning of her slow return to life, the gradual understanding that survival sometimes meant serving something larger than your own pain. Now, 5 years later, Sabina had found a kind of peace in her solitude. Not happiness, she wasn't sure she believed in that anymore, but a steady contentment that came from useful work and the respect of her neighbors. She'd learned to appreciate small pleasures, the first herbs sprouting in spring, the satisfaction of a particularly well-woven piece of cloth, the grateful smile of a mother whose child she'd helped through illness. The recent news that Emperor Valerian was campaigning in the region had stirred the village like stones thrown into a still pond. Imperial armies meant opportunities for those with goods to sell, but also disruption, requisitioned supplies, and the unpredictable behavior of soldiers far from home. Elder Cassius had called a meeting to discuss preparations, hiding valuables, ensuring the grain stores were properly documented, reminding everyone to show proper respect if any imperial officials visited the village. Sabina had listened to the discussions with the detachment of someone whose major losses had already occurred. What could an emperor's presence mean to her? Her taxes were paid, her behavior beyond reproach, her life too small and quiet to attract imperial attention. She would continue her daily routines, tend her garden and her patients, and let the great currents of history flow around her like water around a stone. She had no way of knowing that history was already walking the dusty roads toward her door, disguised as a lonely man seeking something he'd never learned to name. The bronze seal in her wooden chest would soon be joined by other tokens, evidence of a love that would challenge everything she believed about the boundaries between different worlds and her own capacity for joy. The second knock came at dusk the following evening, just as Sabina was banking her fire for the night. She paused in her work, listening to the sound echo through her cottage like a repeat of yesterday's strange dream. For a moment, she wondered if loneliness had finally driven her to hearing things that weren't there. But then it came again. 3 measured raps on oak wood, neither urgent nor hesitant. This time when she opened the door, the man stood differently. Yesterday's weariness had been replaced by something more composed, though his clothes remained simple. A brown woolen tunic, leather boots that showed wear but were well made, a dark cloak that might have belonged to any prosperous farmer or merchant. But tonight, Sabina noticed details she'd missed in yesterday's surprise, the way he held his shoulders, the careful positioning of his hands, the measured quality of his breathing that suggested a man accustomed to being watched and judged. "Good evening," he said, his voice carrying that same strange authority she'd noted before. "I hope I'm not intruding." "You're not," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure why she felt so certain. "Would you like to come in?" The evening's grown cold. He accepted her invitation with a slight bow that seemed both natural and oddly formal. Inside her cottage, the lamplight revealed more than the previous evening's brief encounter had shown. His hands, she noticed as he removed his cloak, bore calluses in specific patterns, not the random marks of general labor, but the precise wear that came from years of sword work. His hair was dark with threads of silver at the temples, and his face carried lines that spoke of both laughter and difficult decisions. "I realize I didn't properly introduce myself yesterday," he said, as she gestured for him to sit at her table. "My name is Valerian, just Valerian. No family name, no indication of status or origin." Sabina filed this observation away with the others. The quality of his Latin, the straightness of his posture, The way his eyes automatically catalogued the exits and defensible positions in her small cottage. "I'm Sabina," she replied, moving to her shelves to gather ingredients for tea. "Sabina Corvus, though most people simply call me Sabina the Healer." "Corvus," he repeated thoughtfully. "A military family?" Her hands stilled for just a moment as she reached for the chamomile. "My husband served in the legions. He died at the Rhine 5 years ago." "I'm sorry," Valerian said, and something in his tone made her turn to look at him. His expression held genuine sympathy, but also a shadow of what might have been guilt. "The Rhine campaigns were costly." Sabina resumed her preparations, mixing herbs with practiced efficiency. "You speak as if you knew something about them." "I've traveled extensively," he said carefully. "One hears things." "Soldiers talk." She poured hot water over the herbs and brought 2 cups to the table, settling across from him. In the lamplight, his face seemed younger somehow, as if the formal mask he wore in daylight had slipped away. "And what brings a well-traveled man to our small village? We're not on any major trade routes." Valerian wrapped his hands around his cup, inhaling the fragrant steam. "Sometimes a man grows tired of major trade routes. Sometimes he seeks quieter places, running from something or toward it." The question hung between them, more personal than she'd intended. But something about this stranger invited honesty, as if normal social boundaries didn't quite apply to their conversations. "Perhaps both," he said finally. "Do you ever feel as though you're living someone else's life? As if the person you were meant to be is trapped inside circumstances you never chose?" Sabina studied his face, seeing something she recognized, the particular loneliness that came not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who couldn't truly see you. "Every day," she admitted. "Though I suppose most people do to some degree, but most people don't have the power to change their circumstances." "And you do?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his tea as if it might contain answers to questions he'd never learned to ask. "Theoretical power and practical power are often quite different things. A man might have the authority to command armies, but lack the freedom to choose his own companions." The words carried weight that made Sabina wonder about this stranger's true station in life. Merchant, perhaps, or minor nobility from one of the provincial cities. Someone with responsibilities that chafed, seeking temporary escape in places where his name carried no obligations. "Yet here you are," she observed, "choosing your companions freely enough." "Here I am," he agreed, looking up to meet her eyes. "Though I wonder if I'm imposing. You have a life, a community, responsibilities of your own. My responsibilities are largely to people who are currently healthy and sleeping peacefully. And my community," she gestured vaguely toward the village center. "They manage quite well without my constant supervision. Still, you must have suitors. A woman of your grace and skill." "I'm a childless widow past her prime fertility," Sabina interrupted gently. "In a village this small, the available men are either much older or much younger, and most need wives who can bear children and work the fields. I'm useful for healing and weaving, but not for building the next generation." That seems short-sighted of them. The simple statement, delivered without pity or false gallantry, warmed something in Sabina's chest that had been cold for a very long time. "Perhaps, but it's also practical. We live close to the frontier here. Strong families are survival. And what about happiness? Companionship, the pleasure of conversation with someone who understands your thoughts." Sabina felt her breath catch slightly. When had anyone last spoken to her about happiness, as if it were something she might actually deserve? "Those are luxuries," she said carefully. "Pleasant when they occur, but not something one can count on." Should they be luxuries? Or should they be as essential as food and shelter? She had no ready answer for that. The question suggested a world view she'd almost forgotten, the possibility that life might offer more than mere survival. That contentment might be something to seek rather than something that occasionally visited unbidden. As if sensing her uncertainty, Valerian changed the subject. "Tell me about your healing work. How did you learn?" The conversation shifted to safer ground, and Sabina found herself describing her gradual accumulation of knowledge, the trial and error of learning which plants helped which ailments, the satisfaction of easing pain and promoting healing. Valerian listened with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested, asking intelligent questions about technique and theory. "You speak of it as both art and science," he observed. "That's unusual. Most healers I've encountered emphasize one or the other. Most healers you've encountered." She noted the phrasing. "How many healers does a traveler typically meet?" A slight flush colored his cheeks. "I meant, that is, in larger cities one observes different approaches." Another careful evasion, she noticed. This man was accustomed to guarding his words, to revealing only what he chose to reveal. Yet beneath the caution, she sensed genuine warmth and interest. Whatever his secrets, his attention to her felt real. The evening deepened around them as they talked. Sabina found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years. Memories of her children's personalities, amusing incidents from her healing practice, her observations about village life and human nature. Valerian, in turn, offered glimpses of a broader world, descriptions of distant cities, different customs, the variety of ways people lived their lives. When he finally rose to leave, Sabina felt a curious reluctance to see him go. The cottage would return to its familiar silence, and she would be left wondering if this strange interlude had been real or imagined. "Will you—" she began, then stopped herself. It wasn't proper to ask a man when he might visit again. "Tomorrow evening, if you're willing," he said, reading her unfinished question. "I find myself reluctant to return to my usual evening activities." After he left, Sabina remained at her table for a long time, staring at the two empty cups and trying to understand what was happening to her. She'd grown comfortable in her solitude, had built a life of quiet usefulness that asked nothing of fate beyond basic survival. Now this stranger had appeared, bringing questions about happiness and choice, treating her as if she was still a woman, capable of desire rather than merely someone who had learned to live without it. She was cleaning the cups when something caught her eye. Glint of gold on the floor near where Valerian had sat. Kneeling, she picked up a small clasp, beautifully worked in the shape of an eagle with outspread wings. It was clearly expensive, the kind of ornament that belonged to someone of considerable wealth. She turned it over in her palm, noting the weight of real gold and the precision of the craftsmanship. Tomorrow she would return it to him, she decided, and perhaps ask more direct questions about who he really was. The golden clasp lay on Sabina's table throughout the next day, catching the light whenever she passed near it. She'd examined it more carefully in the morning sun, noting details that confirmed her suspicions about its value. The precise featherwork on the eagle's wings, the tiny inscription around the edge in script too small and ornate for her to decipher. This was not the ornament of a simple traveler or even a moderately prosperous merchant. This belonged to someone of significant wealth and status. Valerian arrived at his usual time, just as the sun touched the western hills. Sabina had prepared more carefully tonight, braiding her hair with a ribbon she'd kept stored away since Marcus's death, and wearing her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes and reminded her that she was still a woman. Not merely a useful fixture in the village's daily life. "You left something," she said without preamble, holding up the clasp as soon as he entered. His face went carefully neutral, the same expression she'd noticed when she asked probing questions. "Did I? I hadn't noticed. It's beautiful workmanship, expensive. A gift from a grateful patient," he said easily, taking the clasp and tucking it into his belt pouch. "I've learned it's best to accept such gestures graciously, even when they exceed the value of services rendered." Another deflection, smooth as polished marble. Sabina decided to let it pass for now, but filed the observation away with her growing collection of mysteries about this man who called himself simply Valerian. Tonight, their conversation ranged over different territory. He asked about her garden, and she found herself explaining not just what she grew, but why, which herbs worked best in combination, how the timing of harvest affected potency. The delicate balance between encouraging growth and allowing plants their natural resilience. You speak of them as if they were pupils rather than crops, he observed, watching her face as she described nurturing a particularly difficult patch of echinacea. In some ways, they are, she replied. Plants respond to attention and care in ways that go beyond simple cultivation. They seem to sense when they're valued for more than just their utility. And people, do they respond similarly? The question carried undertones that made her pulse quicken slightly. I think so. Most people bloom when they feel truly seen and appreciated for who they are, rather than just what they can provide. Yet so many of us live our entire lives providing services without ever being truly known. There was something almost wistful in his voice, a note of personal experience that made Sabina study his face more carefully. Is that what you're doing? Providing services without being known? Isn't that what you're doing? The counter-question stung because it held truth. She was valued in the village for her healing skills, her reliability, her willingness to help without expectation of payment. But when had anyone last asked about her dreams, her fears, her private thoughts about the life she'd built from the ashes of the one she'd lost? Perhaps we both are, she admitted. Though I wonder what services a traveler provides in a village where he knows no one. Company. Perhaps conversation, the pleasure of speaking with someone who asks thoughtful questions. As if to demonstrate his point, he turned the conversation toward her inner life, asking about books she'd read, places she'd imagined visiting, thoughts she'd never had occasion to share. Sabina found herself talking about dreams she'd almost forgotten, her childhood fascination with the stories traveling merchants told of distant cities, her wonder about how people lived in places where winter never came, her secret ambition to someday write down everything she'd learned about healing, so future generations wouldn't have to learn it all from scratch. You should do that, Valerian said seriously. Write it down. Knowledge like yours shouldn't be lost. I'm not educated enough for such a project. My Latin is serviceable but hardly scholarly. Education and wisdom are different things. You have wisdom worth preserving. The simple validation warmed her more than she wanted to admit. Marcus had been proud of her healing work, but he'd never suggested it might have value beyond their immediate community. This stranger seemed to see possibilities she'd never dared imagine for herself. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the village, young Felix was conducting his own investigation. The Roman coin he'd found near Sabina's cottage had kept him awake the previous night, its unfamiliar weight and markings nagging at his memory. This morning, he'd taken it to Elder Cassius, who'd examined it with the careful attention of someone who'd seen many coins in his years of trade and governance. Interesting, Cassius had murmured, turning the coin in the lamplight. Very recent minting. And this profile, he'd held it closer to his eyes, squinting at the imperial image stamped into the gold. Felix, where exactly did you find this? On the path near Sabina's cottage. It was half buried in the dirt, as if someone had dropped it and not noticed. Cassius had said nothing more, but Felix noticed how carefully the elder wrapped the coin in cloth and placed it in his strongbox. Best not to mention this to anyone else just yet, he'd advised. Coins like this sometimes have complicated histories. Now, as evening settled over the village, Cassius stood at his window, watching the now familiar figure make his way toward Sabina's cottage. The man moved with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to command, his bearing too straight and his steps too measured for a simple traveler. Combined with the coin, clearly imperial, clearly recent, clearly expensive enough that its loss should have been noticed, the pieces formed a picture that made the old administrator uneasy. At the market stalls, Lucia was having similar thoughts as she inventoried her goods and prepared for tomorrow's departure. She'd noticed the stranger's boots during yesterday's brief encounter, leather so fine it seemed to glow, worked with a subtlety that spoke of imperial craftsmanship. The kind of boots that cost more than most villagers saw in a year, yet worn with the casual indifference of someone who owned many pairs equally fine. Sabina's caught herself a wealthy one, her assistant had commented, noticing Lucia's distraction. Wealthy, yes, Lucia had murmured. But wealthy how? And why here, in our little village, when a man with such means could take his leisure anywhere in the empire? The questions multiplied rather than resolving as the days passed. Valerian continued his evening visits, always polite, always interested in Sabina's work and thoughts, always deflecting questions about his own background with skillful conversational redirects. Sabina began to look forward to these encounters with an anticipation that both thrilled and worried her. She found herself checking her appearance in her small mirror, planning topics of conversation, counting the hours until dusk. The change didn't go unnoticed. Lucia mentioned it during one of their afternoon conversations when Sabina stopped by the market to purchase thread for her weaving. "You seem different lately," Lucia observed, studying her friend's face. "Lighter somehow. More like the woman you were before." She caught herself before mentioning the losses that had shaped Sabina's recent years. "I've been sleeping better," Sabina said carefully. "The autumn weather agrees with me." "Does it? Or does a certain evening visitor agree with you?" Sabina felt heat rise in her cheeks. "You've been watching my cottage." "I've been worrying about my friend. This man, whoever he is, isn't what he appears to be. The whole village can see that. What do you mean?" Lucia gestured toward her wagon, loaded with goods from across the empire. "I've spent 20 years trading with people from every level of society. I know how to read the signs of wealth, power, education. Your visitor carries himself like nobility, Sabina. Real nobility, not the minor sort who inherited a villa and a title. The question is, what is someone like that doing here, and what does he want with you?" The conversation planted seeds of doubt that Sabina tried to ignore as evening approached. But when Valerian arrived, she found herself studying him with new eyes, seeing the details that confirmed Lucia's observations. The way he unconsciously expected her to serve him first, then seemed surprised and pleased when she didn't. The casual references to places and events that suggested first-hand knowledge of imperial politics. The underlying assumption that his time was more valuable than other people's, even when he was clearly making an effort to be considerate. Who was this man who'd appeared at her door with his strange declaration about giving her heirs? His courtly manners wrapped in common clothes, his obvious wealth disguised as simple travel gear? And what did he really want from a widow at the edge of the empire? The dried rose from Sabina's wedding bouquet had rested in her wooden chest for 10 years, wrapped in the same linen that held Marcus's military seal. She'd preserved it through grief and loss, through the fever that claimed her children and the news that claimed her husband, through 5 years of widowhood when touching it brought both comfort and pain. Now, as she held it in her palm by lamplight, the petals brittle as ancient parchment, she wondered why she'd kept it so long. It had been beautiful once, deep red, fragrant, picked from the bush that grew beside the village temple where she and Marcus had spoken their vows. The same bush still bloomed each summer, tended by whoever happened to think of it, offering its flowers to new brides and young lovers who carved their initials into the temple steps. Life continuing in cycles that cared nothing for individual loss. Sabina turned the rose between her fingers, feeling petals flake away like tiny pieces of her past. Marcus had been dead longer now than they'd been married. Their children existed only in her memory and in the stories she occasionally shared with village mothers who worried about fever seasons. The woman who'd worn this rose in her hair, who'd believed in forever and happy endings, seemed as distant as a character from the stories she'd heard in childhood. Yet lately, something had shifted. The evening conversations with Valerian had awakened parts of herself she'd thought permanently buried. She found herself wondering what it would be like to trust someone with her deeper thoughts again, to share not just daily pleasantries, but the dreams and fears she'd learned to keep locked away. The possibility felt dangerous and wonderful in equal measure. When Valerian arrived that evening, she had already made her decision. The rose went into her fire before she answered his knock, the dried petals flaring briefly before turning to ash. She didn't know if it was an ending or a beginning, but it felt like something necessary. "You seem different tonight," he observed, as they settled at her table with their customary tea. "More settled, perhaps. Do I?" I feel somewhat unsettled, actually, as if I'm standing at the edge of something I don't understand. He studied her face in the lamplight, his expression gentler than she'd seen it before. Change is always unsettling. Even change we choose. Is that what this is? A choice? What do you think it is? She was growing accustomed to his habit of answering questions with questions, the way he encouraged her to examine her own thoughts rather than simply providing easy answers. Tonight it felt less like evasion and more like genuine interest in her inner life. I think it's two people who are lonely finding unexpected comfort in each other's company, she said carefully. But I also think it's more complicated than that, because I haven't been entirely honest about who I am. The admission surprised her with its directness. She'd expected more deflection, more careful word choices. No, you haven't, though I suspect your reasons are complex. They are. But not dishonorable, I hope. Sabina considered this. You've treated me with respect and kindness. You've listened to my thoughts as if they mattered. You've made me remember that I'm more than just the village healer. Whatever your secrets, I don't believe you mean me harm. I don't, but that doesn't mean I can't cause you harm unintentionally. The warning carried weight that made her study his face more carefully. There was genuine concern there, but also something that might have been fear, not of her, but for her. Are you married? She asked directly. No, betrothed. A longer pause. Not in any way that involves choice or affection. The careful phrasing told her more than a simple denial would have. This man had obligations, expectations, a life somewhere else that didn't allow for the simple human connection they'd found together. She should probably end this now, before either of them became more deeply entangled in something that couldn't lead to happiness. Instead, she found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by the vulnerability she glimpsed beneath his usual composure. What would you choose, if you could choose freely? To stay here, he said without hesitation. To spend my evenings talking with a woman who sees healing as both science and art, who tends a garden like a teacher nurturing students, who asks questions that make me remember who I wanted to be before I became who I was required to be. The words hung between them, like a bridge neither had expected to build. Sabina felt her heart racing in a way she'd almost forgotten, the dangerous flutter of possibility mixing with desire. When had she last felt truly wanted? Not for her usefulness, but for herself. And what would you choose? He asked softly. She thought of the rose crumbling to ash in her fire, of the years she'd spent building walls around her heart, of the careful life she'd constructed. From duty and service and the determination to expect nothing, more from fate than basic survival, to believe that wanting something might actually lead to having it, she whispered. The space between them seemed to shrink without either moving. She was aware of his breathing, of the way the lamplight caught the silver in his hair, of the careful control he was exercising over himself. This close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter as well as responsibility, the fullness of his mouth that suggested both strength and gentleness. Sabina, he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer. Yes?
May I?
She answered by closing the remaining distance between them, her lips meeting his with the desperate hunger of someone who'd forgotten what it meant to be kissed. He tasted of the mint tea she'd prepared and something indefinably masculine, his mouth warm and sure against hers. His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs brushing over her cheekbones with reverent care. The kiss deepened, and Sabina felt 5 years of carefully maintained control crumbling like autumn leaves. She'd forgotten how desire could sweep through her body like wildfire, how the simple act of being wanted could make her feel powerful and vulnerable simultaneously. Her hands fisted in the fabric of his tunic, pulling him closer, needing the solid warmth of him to convince herself this was real. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Valerian rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed as if he were trying to memorize the moment. "I should go," he said, though he made no move to pull away. "Should you?" "If I stay much longer, I won't want to leave at all." "And that would be terrible," He opened his eyes to meet hers, and she saw conflict there, desire warring with duty, want struggling against whatever obligations called him back to his other life. "Not terrible," he said finally. "Impossible," but he kissed her again before he left, a long, lingering farewell that promised he would return. Alone in her cottage afterward, Sabina touched her lips and tried to understand what was happening to her. The careful life she'd built seemed suddenly fragile, like a structure that could be blown away by the first strong wind. She was falling in love with a man whose real name she didn't know, whose circumstances she could only guess at, whose presence in her life might be as temporary as autumn weather. The sensible thing would be to protect herself, to step back before she was hurt beyond healing. Instead, she found herself planning what to cook for tomorrow's dinner, wondering what stories he might share, counting the hours until dusk would bring him back to her door. The military dispatch arrived with the morning's first light, carried by a dust-covered rider whose horse had been pushed hard through the night. Elder Cassius accepted the sealed message with the grim efficiency of someone who'd received too many such communications over the years, though he noticed the imperial seal with particular attention. Official correspondence from the capital was rare in Calum, reserved for matters of taxation, conscription, or the kind of political upheaval that reached even the empire's distant edges. He broke the seal in the privacy of his study, scanning the formal Latin with growing unease. Emperor Valerian's northern campaign had been more successful than initially reported. Several barbarian tribes subdued, new territory claimed, strategic positions secured along the frontier. But it was the final paragraph that made Cassius set down the parchment with shaking hands. The emperor himself was currently residing in the region. The dispatch noted conducting inspections of frontier defenses and meeting with local administrators. His precise location was not specified for security reasons, but regional governors were advised to maintain heightened vigilance and ensure their territories presented appropriately. Respectful appearances should the imperial party visit. Unexpectedly, Cassius walked to his window and stared towards Sabina's cottage, visible in the morning mist like a small ship anchored at the village's edge. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. A mysterious nobleman appearing just as the emperor moved through the region, a man whose bearing and bearing spoke of imperial circles, whose casual wealth suggested access to the highest levels of society. The coin Felix had found, the dropped clasp, the careful evasions about identity and background, all of it pointed toward a conclusion that seemed impossible and yet increasingly inevitable. If he was right, if Sabina's evening visitor was indeed Emperor Valerian, then she was walking into a situation that could destroy her life in ways she couldn't imagine. Imperial attention was a dangerous gift, especially for someone of her humble station. Even if the emperor's intentions were honorable and Cassius had heard enough court gossip over the years to doubt that assumption. What future could there be for a frontier widow and the ruler of the known world? At the market, Lucia was reaching similar conclusions through her own channels of information. The merchant who'd arrived with yesterday's caravan had brought news from the provincial capital, rumors of imperial inspections, sightings of the distinctive standards that accompanied the emperor's personal guard, whispered speculation about why Valerian was spending so much time in territories that had previously warranted only brief official visits. Strange times, her fellow trader had commented over breakfast. They say he's been different since the last campaign, more withdrawn, less interested in the usual imperial pleasures. Some wonder if the burdens of office are finally wearing on him. Lucia had nodded absently, her mind racing through implications she didn't want to acknowledge. She'd grown fond of Sabina over the years, respecting the quiet dignity with which the younger woman had rebuilt her life after devastating losses. To see her friend walking unknowingly toward potential heartbreak, or worse, political scandal, filled Lucia with protective anger. Meanwhile, unaware of the growing concern among her neighbors, Sabina was discovering what it meant to feel beautiful again. She stood before her small mirror, adjusting the blue dress that had become her favorite since Valerian began his visits, noting how the color brought life to her eyes and complemented the honey gold of her hair. When had she last cared about her appearance beyond basic cleanliness and respectability? The answer came with a pang of guilt, not since before the fever took her children, before grief carved hollows in her cheeks and shadows under her eyes. She'd forgotten the simple pleasure of choosing clothes for their beauty rather than their practicality, of arranging her hair to catch the light rather than merely keeping it tidy for work. The guilt faded as she remembered Valerian's expression when he looked at her, the way his eyes lit with genuine appreciation that had nothing to do with what she could provide or how she might be useful. He saw her as a woman worth desiring, worth courting, worth the considerable effort he made to visit her each evening. After years of being valued primarily for her healing skills and reliable character, his romantic attention felt like awakening from a long dream. Their conversation the previous evening had ranged over territory that felt increasingly intimate. He'd asked about her dreams for the future, and she'd surprised herself by admitting she sometimes imagined traveling to see the places she'd heard described by merchants and soldiers. He'd spoken of architecture she might enjoy in distant cities, of gardens where exotic plants grew year-round, of libraries containing more books than she could read in a lifetime. "Would you like to see such places?" he'd asked, and something in his voice suggested the question wasn't purely hypothetical. "With you," she'd responded, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at her boldness. "If you would have me as your companion." The possibility had seemed both thrilling and impossible. A widow from a frontier village traveling to great cities, seeing wonders she'd only imagined. But in his presence, impossible things felt merely improbable, as if the world might be larger and more forgiving than she'd learned to believe. Now, as she prepared for another evening in his company, Sabina allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to truly belong to someone again. Not the desperate clinging of her first marriage, born of youth and social expectation, but the deeper connection of two people who'd survived loss and chosen each other with full knowledge of life's fragility. When Valerian arrived, she noticed immediately that something had changed. He carried himself with more tension than usual, his greeting slightly formal, despite the warmth in his eyes when they met hers. During their meal, she caught him glancing toward the windows as if listening for something, and his responses to her questions seemed distracted. "Is everything well?" she asked finally, setting down her cup and studying his face. "Well enough," he said, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "I've received word that my business obligations may require my attention sooner than I'd hoped." The words hit her like cold water. She'd known this moment would come. He'd never promised permanence, never suggested his visits could continue indefinitely. But knowing something intellectually and feeling its reality were entirely different experiences. "I see," she managed, proud of how steady her voice remained. "When? Perhaps a few days. A week at most. And after that?" He reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb tracing circles over her knuckles. "After that depends on many factors. Not all of them under my control." She wanted to ask about those factors, about the nature of his obligations, about whether there might be any possibility of a future that included both duty and love. But something in his expression warned her that such questions would only cause them both pain. Instead, she turned her hand to intertwine their fingers, holding fast to the warmth and strength of his touch. "Then we should make the most of whatever time we have." "Yes," he agreed, lifting their joined hands to brush his lips across her knuckles. "We should." But even as they settled into their usual conversation, Sabina sensed the shadow of ending falling across their time together. Whatever was calling him away, whatever obligations awaited his attention, she doubted they would prove compatible with evening visits to a humble cottage at the empire's edge. Sabina's mother's wedding ring had lived in the wooden chest beside Marcus's seal and the ashes of her dried rose, waiting through years of widowhood like a promise she'd forgotten how to believe. Now she held it to the lamplight, watching how the simple gold band caught and reflected the flame. Her mother had worn it for 30 years, through harvest failures and fever seasons, through the birth of 5 children and the loss of 2, through all the small joys and grinding hardships of a life lived at the empire's edge. Love isn't about pretty words or grand gestures, her mother had told her during those last weeks before the lung fever claimed her. It's about choosing to stay day after day, even when staying is the hardest thing you can imagine. But what did staying mean when the other person couldn't stay with you? When their obligations pulled them toward a life that had no place for a frontier widow with calloused hands and herb-stained fingers. The morning had brought unwelcome visitors to her cottage, 3 women from the village's more established families, their faces bearing the particular expression of people who believed they were performing a necessary but unpleasant duty. Sabina, the eldest, had begun, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted her right to judge others' choices. "We need to discuss your situation with this stranger." Sabina had offered them seats and tea, maintaining the courtesy that village life demanded even when her heart had begun to race with defensive anger. "What situation would that be?" "Don't pretend ignorance," another had said, her tone sharp with disapproval. "The entire village knows about your evening entertainments. A man visiting an unmarried woman's home after dark, staying for hours. Such behavior brings shame on all of us." "I'm a widow, not a maiden," Sabina had replied carefully. "And my behavior has been entirely proper." "Proper?" The third woman had laughed bitterly. "You've been seen walking with him in the moonlight, disappearing into the shadows beyond the village boundary. Young mothers have to explain to their children why the healer woman has forgotten her place and her dignity." The accusations had cut deeper than Sabina expected, partly because they held grains of truth. She had walked with Valerian in the evenings, had allowed herself to be kissed by a man whose real name she didn't know, had begun to dream of possibilities that respectable widows weren't supposed to consider. "My place," she'd said finally, rising to signal the end of their visit, "is wherever I choose to make it, and my dignity is my own to guard or give as I see fit." But their words had lingered after they left, mixing with her own growing doubts about the wisdom of allowing her heart to open to someone who couldn't or wouldn't tell her who he really was. The afternoon brought a different kind of challenge when Valerian arrived early, carrying a small leather satchel that clearly contained gifts. Sabina's pulse quickened as she opened the door to find him silhouetted against the late sun. But her pleasure dimmed when she saw what he'd brought. Silk ribbons in colors she'd never seen outside of merchants' tales. Spices that would cost more than most villagers earned in a month. A book bound in leather so fine it seemed to glow, filled with poetry written in a hand so elegant it looked like art. Beautiful things, precious things, and entirely inappropriate for a woman of her station to accept from a man who wasn't her husband. "I can't accept these," she said gently, though her hands ached to touch the silk, to feel the smooth leather of the book's binding. "Why not?" He seemed genuinely puzzled by her refusal, because accepting gifts like these would mark me as either a fool or something worse in the eyes of my neighbors. "Because they're too expensive for someone of my circumstances. Because—" She struggled to find words for the growing unease that had been building since their first kiss. "Because I don't know what accepting them would mean." Valerian set the satchel aside and took her hands, his expression growing serious. "They would mean that I care for you, that I want to bring beauty into your life, that I value you enough to share the finest things I can obtain. But where do such gifts come from? What kind of traveler carries silk and rare spices, books that belong in imperial libraries? What kind of man has casual access to luxuries that most people never see?" The questions hung between them like a wall, and she saw the moment when he realized he couldn't deflect them with another question or charming evasion. His hands tightened on hers, and she felt him weighing his words with careful precision. "I told you I haven't been entirely honest about who I am," he said finally. "Then be honest now. Tell me who you really are, what you really want from me, what kind of future you think we might have together, if any." The silence stretched, until Sabina wondered if he would answer at all. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of regret that made her chest ache. "I can't give you what you deserve," he said. "I can't give you the simple life you've built here, the respect of your neighbors, the security of knowing where you stand. I can't give you children who will be raised in safety and obscurity, or the promise that loving me won't ultimately destroy everything you've worked to create. But you can give me yourself?" Another long pause. "Not all of myself. Never all of myself." The admission hit her like a physical blow. She pulled her hands free and turned away, staring out her window at the village, where she'd found purpose and peace after losing everything that had once defined her identity. "Then what are we doing?" she asked quietly. "What is this between us, if not the beginning of something real?" "It's real," he said urgently, moving to stand behind her. "What I feel for you is the most real thing in my life. But reality and possibility aren't the same thing." She leaned back against his chest, feeling his arms come around her waist, allowing herself one moment of perfect belonging before she spoke the words that would change everything between them. "I need to know who you are," she said. "Not just your name, but who you really are, what your life really consists of, what obligations keep you from giving yourself completely. I need to understand what I'm choosing, because I think I'm falling in love with you. And love without honesty is just another kind of loneliness." She felt him stiffen behind her, felt the conflict in the tension of his body against hers. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet she almost missed the words. "If I tell you the truth, everything changes. You may hate me for the deception, or worse, you may try to change yourself into someone you think I need instead of remaining the woman I've come to love. And if you don't tell me, then I'm asking you to love a shadow, and you deserve so much more than that." Sabina turned in his arms to face him, studying the beloved features she'd memorized during their evenings together. The laugh lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, the mouth that had taught her to remember what desire felt like. "Tell me," she said simply. "Whatever it is, whoever you are, tell me and let me decide what I can live with." But even as she spoke the words, Sabina felt a chill of premonition that some truths, once spoken, could never be taken back. The imperial seal ring had been worn by Roman emperors for 3 centuries, each successive ruler adding their own weight to its already considerable significance. The heavy gold band bore the eagle of empire, surrounded by laurel leaves, with script so intricate it seemed to move in lamplight. It was a symbol of absolute power, of the divine right to rule over millions, of authority that stretched from Britain's misty shores to Egypt's ancient sands. And now it lay on Sabina's cottage floor. Having slipped unnoticed from Valerian's finger during their embrace, they had been standing by her window, his arms around her waist, as she gathered courage to demand the truth about his identity. The conversation had grown intimate, desperate with the weight of unspoken secrets, and when she turned in his arms to face him, the movement had loosened the ring's grip on his finger. Neither noticed it fall. They were too absorbed in the gravity of what she was asking, too focused on the decision that would reshape everything between them. It was only when Sabina stepped back, needing space to breathe while she waited for his answer, that her bare foot touched the cool metal. She looked down automatically, expecting to find a dropped coin, or perhaps another of his mysterious possessions that would require returning. Instead, she found herself staring at a ring that made her blood turn to ice water, even in a frontier village. Certain images were universally recognized. Imperial coins passed through the markets regularly, bearing the same eagle and laurel design. Official proclamations carried the seal's impression in wax. Every citizen of the empire knew the symbols of imperial authority, could recognize them, even if they'd never seen the actual ring that created those impressions. Sabina knelt slowly, her hands shaking as she picked up the ring. It was heavier than she'd expected, warm from his skin, undeniably real. She turned it over in her palm, studying the perfect craftsmanship that spoke of imperial workshops, the wear patterns that suggested years of regular use, the unmistakable authenticity that no clever forgery could replicate. When she looked up, Valerian was watching her with an expression of such profound resignation that she knew, even before her mind fully processed the implications, that her worst fears were about to be confirmed. "You're him," she whispered, the words barely audible. "You're Emperor Valerian," he didn't deny it. Couldn't deny it, with the evidence glowing like a brand in her palm. Instead, he closed his eyes and drew in a breath that seemed to carry the weight of worlds. Yes, the simple confirmation hit her like a physical blow. She staggered backward until her spine pressed against the wall, still clutching the ring that had shattered her understanding of everything she thought she knew. "The Emperor of Rome has been visiting my cottage," she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Eating my simple food, drinking my herbal teas, pretending to be just a lonely traveler seeking company." "I wasn't pretending about the loneliness," he said quietly, "or about seeking company. Everything I told you about that was true, but everything else was lies. Your name, your circumstances, your obligations, all lies. Not lies, omissions, evasions. The truth shaped into forms that wouldn't destroy what we were building together." Sabina laughed, a sound stripped of all humor. "What we were building? What did you think we were building? What possible future could there be between an emperor and a village widow?" "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty in his voice was almost worse than deception would have been. "I came here that first night because my scouts reported there was a woman living alone who might be suitable for certain purposes. The Empire needs heirs, and I need a wife who could provide them without the political complications of a senatorial marriage." The words struck her like slaps, each one worse than the last. "Suitable for breeding purposes, you mean? Like livestock selected for desirable characteristics. It wasn't supposed to be like that," he said urgently, stepping toward her. "It was supposed to be a practical arrangement, mutually beneficial. But then I met you, and you weren't what I expected. You are, what? A real person instead of a convenient womb." The bitterness in her voice made him stop moving toward her. "You're extraordinary. Your intelligence, your compassion, the way you see healing as both science and art, the way you've rebuilt your life after devastating losses. I've never met anyone like you. So you decided to court me while concealing who you are, letting me fall in love with a fiction. You said you were falling in love with me." The hope in his voice was so pathetic that Sabina felt tears burning behind her eyes. "I said I was falling in love with Valerian the Traveler, the man who seemed as lonely as I was, who talked to me as if my thoughts mattered, who made me feel like a woman worth desiring instead of just a useful village fixture. I am that man. The circumstances of my birth don't change what exists between us." "The circumstances of your birth?" Sabina stared at him in amazement. "You're not just any nobleman, not just someone with wealth and status. You're the most powerful man in the known world. You have absolute authority over life and death for millions of people. You have senators waiting to marry their daughters to you, armies ready to die at your command, the weight of an entire civilization resting on your decisions." "I know what I am," he said quietly. "Do you?" "Because I'm beginning to doubt it." She held up the ring, its gold surface reflecting the lamplight like captured fire. "This represents power I can't even comprehend. And you dropped it on my floor like a trinket you'd forgotten you were wearing. I forget I'm wearing it, because when I'm with you, I forget I'm emperor. When I'm here, in this cottage talking with you about herbs and healing and the books you dream of reading, I feel like the man I might have been if fate had chosen differently. But fate didn't choose differently." Sabina's voice was growing steadier as shock gave way to painful clarity. "You are the emperor. You can never be anything else. And I am a widow from a frontier village who grows herbs and treats other people's children because my own are dead. Your station doesn't matter to me. It should. It has to. An emperor can't marry a peasant, can't father heirs with a woman who has no noble blood, no political connections, no dowry except her willingness to share his bed. The emperor can do whatever he chooses. Can he? Can he really?" Sabina moved to her table, and set the ring down carefully, as if it might explode if handled roughly. Can the emperor abandon his duty to make a politically advantageous marriage? Can he ignore the needs of the empire for his personal happiness? Can he elevate a nobody to empress and expect the Senate, the army, the people to accept it? The questions hung between them like accusations, and she saw in his face that he knew the answers as well as she did. Imperial power came with constraints that no amount of authority could break. An emperor belonged to the empire first, and to himself, if at all, only after every other obligation had been met. "I thought," he said finally, "that if you came to care for me as I care for you, we might find a way to make it work. An unconventional marriage, perhaps, but a real one. You could come with me, see those cities we talked about, have access to the libraries and gardens I described." "As what? Your empress? Your acknowledged concubine? A peasant woman playing dress-up in imperial robes, while senators' daughters wait for you to come to your senses. As my wife." The words were spoken with such quiet conviction that Sabina felt her anger falter for a moment. But only a moment. Your wife who would never be accepted by Roman society, never be safe from political enemies, who would use her humble origins as a weapon against you, never be able to give you heirs that wouldn't be whispered about and plotted against from the moment of their birth. "You don't know." "I know enough." She turned away from him, unable to bear the hope and pain warring in his expression. "I know that emperors who marry for love instead of politics don't stay emperors for long. I know that women who reach above their station usually fall farther than they climbed. I know that fairy tales are called fairy tales because they don't happen in the real world." The silence stretched until she wondered if he'd left without her noticing. But when she turned back, he was still there, looking older than she'd ever seen him, the weight of his crown visible even though he wasn't wearing it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Sabina looked at the ring gleaming on her table, at the man who'd made her remember what it felt like to hope for more than mere survival, at the simple cottage that had been sanctuary and prison both. "I want you to leave," she said quietly. "I want you to go back to your armies and your senators and your imperial obligations. I want you to find a suitable wife who can give you legitimate heirs and political advantages. I want you to be the emperor Rome needs, instead of the man you think you want to be. And I want you to forget that this ever happened. Because remembering will only cause us both pain that serves no purpose." When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Will you forget?" Sabina closed her eyes, feeling tears slide down her cheeks like rain on stone. "No," she admitted. "I'll remember every evening we spent together. I'll remember what it felt like to be seen and valued and desired. I'll remember the sound of your laugh and the way you listened to my thoughts as if they mattered. I'll remember believing, for just a little while, that love might be possible for someone like me." She heard it. The marriage contract arrived with the morning dispatches, carried by a senatorial messenger whose purple-striped toga and self-important bearing announced his high rank to everyone in the imperial camp. The parchment was bound with silk ribbons and sealed with wax that bore the mark of the most powerful families in Rome. A document that represented months of negotiation, political maneuvering, and the careful balance of interests that kept the empire functioning. Valerian stared at the contract without opening it, knowing exactly what it contained. Senator Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of Caesar's assassin and one of the wealthiest men in Rome, was offering his 18-year-old daughter Claudia in marriage. The girl came with a dowry that would fund 2 legions for a year, family connections that reached into every corner of Roman politics, and breeding that traced back to the legendary figures of the Republic. She was beautiful, accomplished, fertile, and everything an emperor's wife should be. She was also a stranger who would marry him for duty, bear his children for the glory of her family name, and spend her life performing the role of empress without ever knowing or caring about the man beneath the crown. The kind of marriage every emperor before him had made. The kind of marriage the empire expected and required. The kind of marriage that felt like a death sentence after he'd experienced what it meant to be known and loved for himself. Caesar? The messenger's voice cut through his brooding thoughts. The senators await your response. They've indicated that time is of some importance, given the need for imperial heirs and the political advantages of this particular alliance. Valerian set the contract aside without breaking its seals. Tell the senators I am considering their proposal with the gravity it deserves. They will have my answer within the month. The messenger's eyebrows rose slightly at the delay, but he bowed and withdrew. A month was longer than such negotiations usually required, and everyone involved would understand that the emperor was either conducting his own political calculations or struggling with personal reservations that had no place in imperial decision-making. After the messenger left, Valerian walked to the edge of his camp, where the northern frontier stretched away in rolling hills and scattered forests. Somewhere in that peaceful landscape, Sabina was tending her garden, mixing her healing potions, continuing the quiet life she'd built from the ashes of her losses. Did she think of their time together, or had she already begun the process of forgetting that he'd urged on her? General Marcus Antonius found him there an hour later, studying the horizon with the kind of intensity usually reserved for military planning. The men are growing restless, Antonius reported. 3 weeks in the same camp without significant action has them gambling away their pay and picking fights with each other. They need either a battle or orders to move on. And what would you recommend, old friend? Antonius studied his emperor's profile, noting the tension around his eyes and the distraction that had plagued Valerian since his return from whatever business had taken him away from camp each evening. Depends on what's keeping you anchored here. If it's strategic concerns about frontier defense, I'd say we've accomplished our objectives. If it's something else, it's something else. The admission hung between them like a bridge neither man was sure they wanted to cross. Antonius had served 3 emperors in his long career, had seen how the burdens of absolute power could break even the strongest men in unexpected ways. Want to talk about it? He offered. I met someone, Valerian said quietly. Someone who made me remember what it feels like to be human instead of just imperial. Ah. Antonius nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd seen similar situations develop during long campaigns. Local woman. A widow, a healer. The most remarkable person I've ever encountered. And now you're torn between duty and desire. I'm torn between everything I am and everything I want to be. Antonius was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. In my experience, Caesar, such choices rarely have happy endings. Imperial duty doesn't leave much room for personal happiness. No, Valerian agreed. It doesn't, but for the first time in my life, I understand why some men choose love over honor. Why they're willing to sacrifice everything for one person who sees them truly. And are you willing to make that sacrifice? The question struck to the heart of everything Valerian had been wrestling with since leaving Sabina's cottage 3 days ago. Was he prepared to abdicate, to walk away from an empire that needed strong leadership, to abandon millions of people who depended on imperial stability? Could he justify such massive irresponsibility for the sake of personal happiness? I don't know, he admitted, but I know I can't marry Senator Brutus's daughter while I'm in love with someone else. Meanwhile, in the village of Calum, Sabina was discovering what it meant to have her heart broken by an emperor. The physical symptoms were the same as any other grief. The inability to eat, the sleepless nights, the hollow ache in her chest that made every breath feel like an effort. But the circumstances added layers of pain that ordinary heartbreak couldn't match. She'd fallen in love with a lie. Not deliberately, perhaps, but thoroughly. The man she'd kissed, the stranger who'd listened to her dreams and made her feel beautiful again, had never really existed. He'd been a role played by someone whose real life was so far removed from hers that they might as well have been different species. Worse, she couldn't even properly grieve the relationship's end. Who could she tell about her brief romance with the Emperor of Rome? Who would believe such an impossible story? The village women who'd criticized her behavior would only use the truth as further evidence of her unsuitability, while her friends would either think she'd lost her mind or face impossible pressure to report her knowledge to imperial authorities. So she suffered in silence, going through the motions of her daily routine while feeling as though part of her soul had been carved away. Elder Cassius visited twice, clearly wanting to discuss something important, but settling for concerned observations about her health. Lucia stopped by with offers of company and distraction, sensing her friend's distress without understanding its source. Young Felix brought her books from his small collection, hoping literature might provide comfort he couldn't offer directly. All of them meant well, but none of them could address the fundamental problem. Sabina had glimpsed a different kind of life, had briefly believed in possibilities beyond mere survival, and now had to find a way to return to contentment with what she'd had before. It was Felix who brought news that changed everything. Arriving at her cottage on the 4th day, with his face pale and his hands shaking. "Sabina," he said without preamble, "I need to tell you something. About your visitor." She felt her stomach clench with dread. "What about him?" "He's Emperor Valerian. I'm certain of it now." Elder Cassius received a dispatch confirming the Emperor's presence in this region. "And the timing, the appearance, the coin I found, it all fits." Sabina stared at the young priest, wondering if her guilt was written clearly enough on her face for him to read. "That's impossible, is it? Think about his bearing, his speech, the quality of his clothes despite their simple cut. Think about how he carried himself, how he seemed to expect deference even when he was trying to be humble. Even if you're right," she said carefully, "what does it matter? He's gone now." "Gone where?" "Back to his camp." "Back to his armies?" Felix leaned forward urgently. "Sabina, if the Emperor was visiting you regularly, if he showed you particular attention, there could be consequences. Political implications. Imperial favor can be as dangerous as imperial displeasure." The irony was almost laughable. Felix was warning her about dangers she'd already experienced and rejected, consequences she'd chosen to avoid by sending Valerian away. But she couldn't explain that without revealing knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. "I'll be careful," she said instead. "Will you? Or will you do something foolish like trying to see him again?" The question caught her off guard with its accuracy. Because despite everything, despite the impossibility of their situation, despite her practical understanding of why they could never have a future together, part of her did want to see him again. Part of her wondered if love might be strong enough to overcome even the obstacles that separated an emperor from a village widow. "I'm not a fool, Felix." "No, but you're in love. And love makes fools of us all." After he left, Sabina sat alone in her cottage, surrounded by the silence that had once been sanctuary and now felt like a tomb. The practical part of her mind, the part that had learned to survive devastating loss, insisted that she'd made the right choice. An emperor and a peasant woman? It was impossible, would always be impossible, could only lead to pain for everyone involved. But her heart whispered different possibilities. What if love could be stronger than duty? What if he truly was willing to sacrifice everything for her, as he'd seemed to suggest? What if she was throwing away the one chance for real happiness she might ever have? The questions tormented her through another sleepless night, and by dawn, Sabina knew she couldn't continue this way. She needed to know what Valerian was thinking, what choice he was making, whether their brief time together had meant as much to him as it had to her. She needed to see him one more time, if only to say goodbye properly and find some kind of closure that would allow her to move forward with her life. The decision terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. But by mid-morning, she was already planning how to find the imperial camp and what she would say when she saw the man she loved wearing his emperor's crown. The imperial crown sat on its ceremonial cushion inside Valerian's command tent, its golden circlet catching the afternoon light that filtered through the canvas walls. Rubies and sapphires gleamed between the raised eagles that represented Rome's dominion over the known world, each gemstone worth more than most people saw in a lifetime. It was beautiful, terrible, and utterly alien to everything Sabina had ever known. She stood at the entrance to the camp, her simple brown dress and worn cloak marking her as clearly as if she'd worn a sign declaring her station. The guards had stopped her immediately, their hands moving to sword hilts until she'd spoken Valerian's name with the quiet authority of someone who expected to be admitted to his presence. The Emperor isn't receiving petitioners. Today, the centurion had said, his voice polite but firm. Tell him Sabina the healer is here, she'd replied. He'll see me. The message had been carried into the camp's inner circles, and now she waited while men in armor debated whether a village woman's claim deserved the Emperor's attention. Around her, the machinery of empire continued its work, messengers arriving with dispatches, officers consulting maps, soldiers maintaining equipment with the practiced efficiency of professional warriors. This was Valerian's real world, she realized. Not quiet evenings in cottage lamplight, but the constant pressure of command. The weight of decisions that affected millions. The isolation that came from being the single point upon which an entire civilization balanced. How had she ever imagined he could simply walk away from all of this? The Emperor will see you. The words startled her from her thoughts. A young officer stood before her, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with curiosity. What kind of village woman could command imperial attention with just her name? The walk through the camp felt endless. Sabina was aware of eyes following her, of whispered conversations that stopped as she passed, of the growing sense that she was walking toward something that would change everything between them forever. She'd come here with half-formed plans of talking sense into both of them, of finding some way to say goodbye that would bring closure and peace. Now, surrounded by the visible evidence of who Valerian truly was, those plans seemed childishly naive. The command tent was larger than her entire cottage, its interior divided into sections for military planning, official audiences, and private quarters. Maps covered every available surface, marked with the positions of legions, supply routes, and frontier defenses. This was where the fate of nations was decided, where a single man's choices rippled outward to affect millions of lives. And there, standing with his back to the entrance as he studied a map of the northern territories, was the man she'd fallen in love with. He'd changed into imperial regalia for her visit, a purple tunic with gold threading, a cloak that seemed to capture and reflect every color of light, boots that gleamed like polished obsidian. When he turned to face her, the crown rested on his dark hair like it had been crafted specifically for him, which, of course, it had been, but his eyes were the same. Despite the imperial finery, despite the setting that proclaimed his absolute authority, his eyes still held the warmth and recognition that had made her feel seen and valued during their evening conversations. Sabina. Her name in his voice carried the weight of longing, surprise, and something that might have been hope. Your Imperial Majesty. She managed a credible approximation of a bow, though her knees shook with the strangeness of offering such formal deference to someone who'd kissed her by moonlight. Don't, he said quickly, moving toward her. Not you. Never you. But this is who you are. She gestured at the tent around them, at the crown that marked him as ruler of the known world. This is your reality, not quite conversations in a cottage at the Empire's edge. Both are my reality. The man who sits with you in the evenings talking about herbs and healing, that's real too, is it? Can it be when the Emperor has obligations that leave no room for simple human happiness? Valerian was quiet for a moment, his hands moving to the crown, as if it were a burden he longed to set aside. What if I chose differently? What if I decided that some things matter more than imperial duty? Sabina felt her breath catch. What are you saying? I'm saying that I've been offered a marriage contract with Senator Brutus's daughter. 18 years old, beautiful, perfectly bred for producing imperial heirs. Everything an emperor's wife should be. The words hit her like physical blows, but she forced herself to remain still, to listen to whatever else he needed to say. I'm saying that I can't sign that contract. I can't marry someone else when I'm in love with you. I can't pretend to be satisfied with duty when I've experienced what it feels like to be truly known and cared for. So what will you do? I've been considering abdication. Stepping down from the throne, naming a successor, walking away from all of this. He gestured at the tent around them, but his eyes never left her face. For me, she whispered, for us, for the possibility of a life where we could be together without the weight of empire between us. Sabina stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. The Emperor of Rome, willing to give up absolute power for love. It was the stuff of fairy tales, the kind of romantic gesture that existed only in stories told around winter fires. You can't, she said finally. Rome needs you. The empire needs strong leadership. You can't abandon millions of people for one woman's happiness, can't I? He reached up and lifted the crown from his head, holding it between them like an offering. This is just gold and gemstones, Sabina. Beautiful, but ultimately meaningless, without the man who wears it. I could choose to be just a man, and let someone else bear the weight of empire, looking at him holding the crown. Seeing the hope and vulnerability in his expression, Sabina understood that this moment would define both their lives. He was offering her everything, his love, his future, his willingness to sacrifice ultimate power for the chance at personal happiness. The question was, did she have the courage to accept it? The simple gold band lay in Valerian's palm, catching the late afternoon light that slanted through the tent walls. It was nothing like the elaborate jewelry that adorned imperial fingers. No gemstones, no intricate engravings, no symbols of power or divine authority. Just plain gold, worked by the village blacksmith in Calum with careful attention to proportion and weight. Designed to fit the finger of a woman who'd spent her life healing others with hands that bore the honest calluses of useful work. I had this made, Valerian said quietly, his eyes never leaving Sabina's face. 3 days ago, when I thought I might have the courage to ask you properly, before I knew you'd discovered who I really am. Sabina stared at the ring, her heart racing as she tried to process what she was seeing. After everything they'd been through, the deception, the revelation, the painful separation, he'd still had a wedding ring made for her. Not an imperial band laden with political symbolism, but something simple and honest that spoke of the man beneath the crown, rather than the emperor who wore it. You were planning to propose, she said, the words barely above a whisper. I was planning to ask if you'd be willing to build a life with me, whatever form that life might take. Emperor or exile, crowned or common, I want to spend whatever years I have remaining with the woman who taught me what it means to be truly seen. Sabina felt tears building behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. This moment was too important for anything but absolute clarity. And what would that mean? What kind of life could we build together? I don't know, he admitted, and his honesty was both terrifying and liberating. If I abdicate, we could disappear into the provinces, live quietly somewhere far from imperial politics. You could continue your healing work, and I could learn to be useful in whatever way a former emperor might manage. And if you don't abdicate, then you'd become empress, with all the dangers and complications that entails. You'd be a target for political enemies, a symbol others would use for their own purposes. A woman trying to find her place in a world that doesn't easily accept those who rise above their birth station. Neither option sounds particularly appealing, Sabina said, though she was studying his face with growing wonder. Why are you willing to risk either one? Because the alternative is living without you, and I've discovered I don't know how to do that anymore. Valerian stepped closer, the ring still balanced on his palm between them. These past few days, since you sent me away, have been the longest of my life. Food tastes like ash, wine like water. I can barely focus on the dispatches that require my attention. I keep expecting to hear your voice, keep turning towards sounds that might be your footstep. I keep finding myself planning what to cook for your evening visit, Sabina admitted. Setting 2 cups instead of 1, listening for your knock at the door. Then marry me, he said simply. Not because duty requires it, not because politics demands it, but because two people who've found something rare and precious shouldn't let it slip away without a fight. Sabina looked around the command tent, at the maps showing territories larger than she could imagine, at the correspondence that connected this isolated spot to the corridors of power in distant Rome, at the crown resting on its cushion like a golden reminder of everything that made their love complicated. What about your obligations? Your duty to the Empire? What about my duty to myself? To the possibility that love might be more important than power? Valerian's voice carried conviction that seemed to grow stronger with each word. I've spent my entire adult life serving the Empire. Perhaps it's time the Empire served me for once. And if choosing love means choosing poorly, if your abdication leads to civil war, political chaos, suffering for millions, then we'll face those consequences together. But if choosing duty means choosing a life without love, without the daily joy of your company, without the possibility of children raised by parents who actually chose each other, then I'm not sure duty is the noble choice it pretends to be. Sabina felt something shift inside her chest, like ice breaking up after a long winter. She'd been so focused on the obstacles, so certain that their different stations made love impossible, that she'd forgotten to consider what might happen if they simply decided the obstacles didn't matter. You'd really do it, she said wonderingly. You'd really give up the crown for me. I'd give up everything for you. But more than that, I'd build everything with you. A new life, a different kind of purpose, a future where we wake up each morning choosing each other instead of enduring whatever fate has assigned us. And you think it would be enough? A quiet life in some distant province, far from the centers of power you've known? With you? Valerian smiled, and she saw in his expression the same warmth that had drawn her to him during those first evening conversations. It would be everything. Sabina looked at the ring one more time, then raised her eyes to meet his. Ask me, she said quietly. What? Ask me properly, the way you would have asked if I'd never found your ring, if we'd had time to let our feelings grow naturally, if the world were simpler than it is. Valerian's smile broadened as he knelt before her. The gold band balanced between his fingers like a promise. Sabina Corvus, he said, his voice carrying all the formal gravity of imperial pronouncement and all the tender intimacy of private love. Will you marry me? Yes, she whispered, then louder, with the fierce certainty of someone who'd decided to trust her heart despite every rational objection. Yes, I will marry you. As he slipped the simple ring onto her finger, Sabina felt the last of her defenses crumble away, replaced by something she'd thought lost forever, the courage to believe in happiness. The child's first shoe was impossibly small, crafted from the softest leather by artisans who understood that imperial heirs required perfection even in their earliest steps. Yet it was the imperfection that made Sabina smile as she held it to the morning light. A tiny mark where the leather had been pressed just slightly off-center, evidence that human hands had shaped it with love rather than merely duty. 1 year had passed since her marriage to Valerian, 1 year since she'd chosen to trust in the possibility that love might indeed conquer the practical obstacles that had seemed insurmountable. The child growing within her had been conceived not from imperial obligation, but from the passionate joy of two people who'd found each other against all odds and refused to let circumstances dictate the boundaries of their happiness. The morning sun streamed through the windows of their private chambers in the palace at Mediolanum, where Valerian had chosen to establish a secondary imperial residence, far enough from Rome to escape the constant scrutiny of senatorial politics, close enough to the frontier to maintain effective military command. It had become their compromise between the demands of empire and the needs of their unconventional marriage. "You're awake early?" Valerian's voice came from behind her, warm with sleep and contentment. Sabina turned to find him watching her from their bed, his dark hair tousled and his face bearing the relaxed expression she'd learned to treasure. In these private moments, he looked like the man who'd first appeared at her cottage door, not an emperor burdened by the weight of worlds, but simply someone who'd found unexpected joy in quiet companionship. "The baby's been restless," she said, settling beside him and placing his hand on the gentle curve where their child grew. "I think he's eager to meet his parents." Or she, Valerian corrected, his palm warm against her belly. "She might be a daughter who'll inherit her mother's healing gifts and her father's stubborn determination. Either way, they'll inherit complications no child should have to bear." It was a conversation they'd had many times over the past months. The practical concerns that came with bringing imperial heirs into a world that still whispered about the peasant woman who'd become empress. But each time they discussed it, Sabina felt more confident that love would provide what political wisdom could not. "They'll also inherit strength," Valerian said quietly. "From a mother who rebuilt her life after devastating loss, who learned to find purpose in healing others, who had the courage to trust her heart when every rational thought said it was dangerous, and from a father who was willing to risk everything for love." Sabina moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard where early morning light caught the fountain's spray and tiny rainbows. The past year had brought challenges she couldn't have imagined during those simple evening conversations in her cottage, navigating court politics as an outsider, learning the complex protocols of imperial life, enduring the whispered speculation about her worthiness and her motives. But it had also brought unexpected joys. Valerian had been right about the libraries. She'd spent winter evenings reading philosophy and poetry in languages she was still learning, expanding her understanding of the healing arts through access to texts she'd never dreamed of seeing. The gardens provided herbs from across the empire, allowing her to develop remedies that helped not just individuals, but entire communities affected by illness or injury. Most importantly, their marriage had strengthened rather than weakened Valerian's rule. The senators who'd initially opposed his choice had gradually come to respect an empress who worked alongside physicians during plague outbreaks, who funded the construction of hospitals in frontier towns, who treated imperial protocol as less important than human need. The common people saw in their love story proof that merit could triumph over birth, that even emperors might choose heart over politics. "I've been thinking," Valerian said, joining her at the window, "about what we want to tell our child about how we met." "The truth?" "Which truth?" "That I appeared at your door with a crude declaration about giving you heirs, that I deceived you about who I was for weeks, that we fell in love despite every reasonable objection to such a union." Sabina smiled, remembering that first evening when she'd opened her door to find a stranger whose loneliness had called to her own. All of it. The whole complicated, impossible, wonderful truth. Even the part where you threw my ring at me and ordered me to leave. Especially that part. A child should know that love worth having is love worth fighting for, even when the fighting means saying difficult things to people we care about. Valerian wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched the sun climb higher over their domain. "And what would you tell them about the future? What kind of life we're preparing for them?" Sabina considered this, her hands resting over his where they lay across her belly. "I'd tell them that they're loved. Not for what they represent or what duties they might fulfill, but for who they are. A unique person born from the joining of two people who chose each other freely. I'd tell them that power without compassion is meaningless, but compassion without courage is ineffective. I'd tell them that healing, whether of bodies, hearts, or kingdoms, requires both knowledge and intuition, both skill and love, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is open your door when love knocks, even if it doesn't look like what you expected." As if responding to their voices, the child stirred within her, a flutter of movement that seemed to acknowledge the conversation about their future. Sabina placed her hand over the spot where she'd felt the motion, wondering what dreams might already be forming in that small, growing mind. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. choosing this path instead of the marriage the Senate wanted, the conventional life of an emperor with a conventional empress. Valerian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the certainty of someone who'd tested his convictions against reality and found them sound. "Never," he said simply. "I regret the deception that marked our beginning, and I regret the complications our love has brought to your life. But I'll never regret choosing to build a future with someone who sees me truly, who challenges me to be better than duty alone would require, who taught me that the heart's wisdom is as valuable as the mind's calculations." Sabina leaned back against his warmth, feeling the solid strength of the man who'd given up a conventional imperial marriage for the uncertain joy of loving freely. Around them, the palace stirred to life, servants preparing for another day of imperial business, courtiers planning their approaches to various political concerns, the machinery of empire continuing its ancient work. But here, in this moment of morning quiet, they were simply two people who'd found each other across the vast distance between their different worlds, who'd chosen to believe that love might indeed be the most powerful force in the universe, strong enough to bridge any gap, brave enough to face any opposition, wise enough to build something lasting from the most unlikely foundations. The child's first shoe lay forgotten on the windowsill, a tiny symbol of the future they were creating together, not perfect, perhaps, but crafted with the kind of love that could transform even the most impossible dreams into beautiful reality.